that it's being recorded. Here we go. All right, so welcome everyone to Linguistics Club Lavender Linguistics panel. Thank you for coming. My name is Kathleen Bozarth. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'm the secretary of the Linguistics Club, and I'm pretty honored to be your panel moderator today. And so I just have a quick question for the presenters. Would you prefer that you each present and then have questions individually after your presentations, or do you want to save questions for the end?
Maybe individually?
I'll second that. I'm kind of indifferent, but I like that.
Okay, cool. And so after the presenters are finished, if you want to just unmute yourself and ask a question, or raise your hand and I can call on you, or feel free to use the chat. I'm happy to navigate those situations for you. So our first presenter is Abigail Biani Heitzman, and she's a second-year MFA candidate in English at Wichita State University. Her research focuses primarily on Filipina, Filipino, Filipinx American literature, and the digital humanities. Upon graduation, she hopes to teach decolonial English abroad, focusing on fostering bilingual critical literacy across cultures. So, clap emojis for Abby.
All right, so I'll go ahead and share my screen. Let me know if, like, when I change slides, anything goes wrong, because I tend to have technical difficulties as well. Okay, can everybody see that? Okay. So my presentation is on Swardspeak, or the gay slang of the Philippines. And this isn't a very heavily research-driven presentation. It's more of an introductory overview to sort of introduce you to it, give you an idea of what it is, and maybe prompt you to look into it further or explore other similar slang subsets. Okay. So first of all, what is Swardspeak? My definition here is that it is a dynamic argot of the LGBTQ+ community in the Philippines. And we'll break each of these terms down. So first of all, what does it mean to be dynamic? Swardspeak is considered a dynamic slang because it is constantly changing and evolving with time. New vocabulary emerges as a result of new members joining the community, developments in technology and popular culture, and the incorporation of loanwords from other languages. The new vocabulary is then absorbed into Swardspeak, and it often displaces old vocabulary, which means it is constantly changing. And then what is an argot? So for you who aren't familiar with linguistics, an argot is a jargon, slang, or particular phraseology of a class or community, and in this case, it is the LGBTQ+ community in the Philippines. And just to narrow down what we mean by LGBTQ+ community, so the people who use Swardspeak traditionally would be considered bakla or bading individuals. So bakla and bading have varying meanings depending on context and individual identities, but these terms generally refer to either effeminate gay cisgendered men, transgender women, and otherwise queer identifying individuals. Mostly those who are assigned male at birth. That's what AMAB stands for. Bakla and bading are sometimes also considered a third gender. This stems from indigenous culture where it wasn't a binary gender format like we have in the West. And just to tack on for now, and we'll revisit this later, but also Swardspeak isn't limited to LGBTQ+ community anymore. I would say that it is also very popular with cis heterosexual millennials as well, due to pop culture influences. Okay. So why do bakla and bading people use Swardspeak? The Philippines is a complex country with a complicated past and many cultures within it, which means it is not a monolith. But in the pre-colonial Philippines, women and bakla men were treated very differently than they were under colonialism or even today. Other than the Datu, who is the tribal chief and often a man of a particular village, the Babaylan in Visayan and Catalonan in Tagalog was the highest and most respected position. The Babaylan or Catalonan were women or Bakla individuals who acted as shamans, priests, and oracles for their village. During the Spanish colonization of the Philippines, Catholic missionaries worked to erase the role of the Babaylan or Catalonan from the culture as they worked to Christianize the Filipinos. As a result, women and queer people were subjugated and oppressed just as they were in European countries. Following American colonization, Swardspeak developed in the 20th century as a secret language for gay men to use to communicate with each other under the nose of their heteronormative society. Today, the Philippines is still a very Catholic country, and sexism and homophobia are still major issues. However, large cities like Manila have acted as havens for queer people, resulting in vibrant queer communities that put on extravagant drag shows, parades, and other displays of queer pride. Nevertheless, an argot like Swardspeak still plays a useful role in the LGBTQ+ community. Since LGBTQ+ issues are still so polarizing in the country, using an argot that is recognizable to other members of a community, but not those outside of it, ensures that a queer person can safely identify themselves to a suspected fellow queer person without alerting those around them. Other speakers of Swardspeak simply use the argot as an expression of their identity and means of connecting with the larger LGBTQ+ culture. Recently, even some people who are not members of the LGBTQ community, mostly millennials, have picked up on Swardspeak words and phrases through exposure. So we've talked a lot about what Swardspeak is and defining terms surrounding it, but I want to give you some examples of what Swardspeak actually looks like and sounds like. So here's my very small subset of a lexicon here. And these terms of Swardspeak originate from Philippine languages, Spanish, English, and some Japanese. Sward itself is a mostly outdated Philippine term for a gay man. I would say that you wouldn't hear millennials or Gen Z people use it. It's mostly an older generational term. Other common and popularly used terms are charot, joke, which is very common with millennial pop culture. Chaka, which means ugly, bit, which means I like, which is an abbreviated form of ate or older sister and can also mean an older female friend. And gandara, which means pretty, and it's borrowed from ganda, which is the formal word for pretty in Tagalog. It should also be noted that more recently, Becky is the preferred term for a gay man in the Philippines. And so Bekimon is the new invented term for Swardspeak. And this recent change is a perfect example of the dynamic and ever-changing nature of this particular argot. Okay. And then this is sort of branched off of Swardspeak. I wouldn't say that Thibaut is strictly a Swardspeak term, mostly because it originated outside the community as a derogatory term, but it's recently been reclaimed. So Thibaut comes from the English tomboy, and it literally means boyish, but has the connotation of lesbian. And like I said, it was originally used as a derogatory term, but has since been reclaimed by lesbians in the community. And I thought it was interesting because maybe 2 years ago, Moira de la Torre, who is a pop singer in the Philippines, released a song called Titibo Tibo. And a lot of people in the LGBTQ+ community originally really liked the song because they thought it was like an anthem. But Del Torre actually came out and said that she is straight and she doesn't identify the song as being a queer anthem. She sees it as just a song about a girl who is boyish. And actually in her discussion of the song, she came under fire because she said it was about a straight tomboy who becomes girly after falling in love with a boy. And obviously that upset a lot of people who identified with the term with Thibaut, and they thought that it wasn't her term to use or reclaim or change the meaning. So I think that points out a really good issue with the appropriation of Swardspeak and other LGBTQ+ language in the Philippines. Because as it becomes part of popular culture, I feel like there's the issue of maybe it losing its original association with the LGBTQ plus community. So like I said, this isn't a very heavily researched presentation, and a lot of that comes from the fact that it's not a very heavily researched topic overall. So things that could be sources for further research that personally I would like to explore would be the language of people who are assigned female at birth, so lesbians, bisexual women, transgender men in the LGBTQ plus Filipino community, because a lot of the research focuses mostly on bading and bakla men. I also think that perspectives on the appropriation of language are needed. So like my case study, I think we need to explore the implications of SwordSpeak becoming a trendy, popular language. And then also, I think it'd be interesting to explore SwordSpeak in America or the wider diaspora of Philippine culture, because a lot of research is focused on the Philippines. And I think it's interesting to see how language changes over geographical space. And if you're interested, these are some of my sources that I used while I was curating that small lexicon and also just defining some terms. If you want a copy of my sources, just send me an email. I sent out the email before this with the link, so you can just reply to that. Okay.
Thank you, Abby. So we'll open it up. We have time for some questions before we move on to our next presenter. So does anyone want to ask Abby anything?
Hi, Abby. I don't know if you can see me yet. Hi. Great presentation. And this was something that I did not know about, but I actually have a comment and a question. Let me tell you about my comment first. So in India, there is a very similar kind of terminology, and you might have come across this. It's called the Hijra community. And so, you know, when you were talking about the bakla and the baiting kind of terminology, that was the first thing that came to my mind, the Hijra community. And so there's a lot of work that has happened looking at the Hijra community from, you know, the perspective of like pop culture and, you know, work that I've looked in terms of like films that have portrayed them and all that. Not so much about the linguistics aspect of it, but that would be something I think that has parallels with what you're talking about. So that's a great place to kind of, you know, look at some inspiration for future research. My question has to do with whether you're familiar with, similar to like the Latinx movement in Hispanic communities, whether there is a similar movement in the Filipino community to kind of move Filipino to like a Filipinx kind of terminology. Is that something that has happened? Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, so it's actually funny that you bring that up because, so in my bio, I did say, like, I study Philippine OX literature, but it's actually something that's come under a bit of a debate recently. So I would, like, I don't have like proper sources for this, but there's a lot of discourse on Twitter about it. And actually, like, some of it comes from the Latinx community as well. So there is this push for a more inclusive term, but there's also pushback because people see the X suffix as being like an English imposition. So there are actually some people who prefer like Latin A with like an E at the end, and the same goes for Filipine. But it hasn't been formalized in any way that I know of, and I think within Philippine studies, they're still searching for a term. Personally, I prefer Philippine at, with the ending AT, because in Tagalog, at means and, so it's kind of like saying this and that. But again, that's just like a personal thing for me. It's not like a well-researched topic or anything.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Abby, I had a question. I was curious about the phenomenon that seems to happen with queer slang or even, dialects or argos of younger generations kind of adopting them. I feel like that is also something that has happened here in the United States, especially with the popularization of like drag culture. I don't know if this is so much a question as maybe just a further point of research, possibly in the future for your studies, but I'm curious about that. If it's just kind of like a counterculture and I don't know if it's a fetishization of it or not, but I think there's something there,
Yeah, I agree. I'm honestly, like, the first comparison that came to mind for me was like the use of African American vernacular English on the internet. So originating in Black communities and becoming super popular with Gen Z and millennial people on Twitter and Instagram and things like that. I think it's kind of similar in the Philippines. You have this community who's been forced to create these more creative terms and terminologies, and then it's sort of adapted by the wider culture. And that's why I think like more research on the perspectives of that phenomenon is needed, because like I haven't seen anything pushing back against cis and heterosexual millennials using sword speak. And I wonder if there's like a similar impulse in trying to, I guess, just be aware of the origins of it and be sensitive about the usage with sword speak.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question, if that's okay. Um, you mentioned that like some of the terms are in the process of being reclaimed, um, such as Tebow,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm curious if like uh, non-queer usage of it kind of complicates the reclamation process. I wonder if like somebody like a popular singer comes out with a song that uses a term that's part of it, and then like there's this weird dissonance happening to where it's like, oh well, like we thought that it meant this, but apparently it doesn't, for this person who is not queer. I wonder if popular usage of slang terms can kind of complement or complicate that process of reclamation.
Yeah, that was my thinking also, because I think that like having these terms used in a positive way is obviously good, but when it is at odds with how the uh, community of origin wants to use it, it becomes an issue. Um, and with Tebow, like as recently as the 80s, it was used as a very negative word. My mom has told me stories of the times when she was called Tebow, and it was like very emotionally difficult for her. And so seeing a song that came out within the last 2 years about a positive use of it, but at odds with the traditional meaning, I think really just complicates it. And it, like I said, it really upset a lot of members of the community.
I think we'll have time for maybe we can address this last question in the chat from Steph. She says, "Hi, Abby. This is a weird question, and I could be wrong here, but is bet one of those terms that millennials, Gen Zs use? I've seen bet on Twitter before, but I'm not sure if it's the same bet. I think it is, but I'm not sure."
Yeah, so this was a term that I kind of debated putting on there, because I did think like, okay, well, this is something that I hear in American English slang also. But at least from what I could find, it seems to have like a slightly different meaning and a different origin. But like Filipino culture is very heavily influenced by American culture, so there's a good chance that it is borrowed from that.
Cool. Thanks, Abby. That was a great presentation.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm going to second that. And I'm excited. Your research questions were all kind of like the same things that I was thinking through your presentation, like who owns the language and why is there such a heavy focus on the assigned male at birth speaking population as opposed to the assigned female at birth speaking population. So really cool. Thank you, Abby.
Thank you.
Yes. And next we have Sally. And Sally studies poetry writing at WSU while taking classes to prepare for an art therapy master's program. That sounds really cool. She serves at a ramen restaurant on the side and enjoys all types of art. So clap emojis for Sally, please.
Hi, thanks for the introduction. And Abby, that was a really wonderful few slides. My research is still ongoing, but I essentially wanted to explore queer Chinese slang and whether Chinese Americans were aware of or understood different terms that queer people in mainland China used. For this research, I used a survey, and today I'll just share and translate some of the terms in the survey. I'm going to share the screen. It's been a while since I did this, so I'm going to make sure, I'm not sure if I'm doing it right, but hold on. Is this working?
Yes.
Okay. So the first is tomboy, T, which is actually a loan word from, or like abbreviated from tomboy, and that's I guess similar to Tebow, and that means basically like butch, I guess, like if you translate it. P is stands for puo, which is kind of like wife, so then that translates to like femme, I would say, in English queer slang. And I think that's interesting because, of course, like it's kind of like a heteronormative way of like understanding what is like femme and what is butch, but it comes, I guess femme still comes from like feminized or feminine. So there's that. And then H is like switch, which is like not femme or like either femme. You can go between, I guess, like femme and masc. And then GL just stands for girls love. It's I guess a lot of these, they use just like abbreviations of like English words. Les is just lesbian, and then BI is like bisexual, BL boys love. And then I heard in like, I think a lot of the assigned male at birth communities, they use, and gay communities, they use like numbers to, especially on like dating apps, to differentiate between like top and bottom and stuff like that. And I think it's really interesting that it's like numbers, but so 1 would be top, 0 would be bottom, 0.5 is like a switch. And then Lala is lesbian. And so it's kind of just also from the sound of lesbian, like the beginning of it. And then Kuar is queer. So I'll point to it, which is kind of funny because cool means cool. And then Kuar is just a weird way of saying queer. Tongxing is just like homosexual. And then 同志 used to be comrade in like just back in the days, but now it also like connotes lesbian or bisexual or any queer person. And then 女同志 is lesbian, which is 女 is female, and then 同志 is like comrade. So yeah, and then 出轨 is to come out of the closet literally. So 出 is to come out, and then 轨 is closet. And then this is it's pronounced gay, so it's like gay in Chinese or gay in English. So yeah, I can I'm definitely still working on this research, but I think it's really interesting to just like learn about different cultures, and I think this is also an Argo. Let me pause this share, or how do I exit? Let me see. Okay, so my further research that I would love to conduct on this, like once I finish this, is relationship, just like looking at the relationship between assigned male at birth queer people and assigned female at birth queer people in China, and just understanding like how people in those communities interact. So thank you.
Thank you, Sally. Okay, so we'll open up for questions for Sally.
Not necessarily a question, but it's more so a statement of I love it so much, the use of comrade. I think it's just so funny.
I think it's so cool too. I really like it. So
I had a question, Sally. First, I wanted to make an observation of, I think it's really interesting how numbers are being used. I think that's something that's really unique. I don't think I've ever seen it in another um, like queer slang before. So that's really, really cool. I wonder how is it has like just to do anything with like the culture, especially with, um, yeah, I'm not sure what the culture around being queer is in China, but
Mhm. I was wondering if it's just because it's like on dating apps, like it's more simple and like easier to put in your bio, and then also maybe it is like kind of like with Swartspeak, like more in the Hijra community, like more hidden maybe than so that people who aren't in the community like don't know what it is. I actually had to like the reason I even know about some of these terms is because I went to Chengdu, which is kind of the gay capital of China, with my mom. It was like it's like southern part of China, and I went to like a queer bar, like a lesbian bar, and just like asked a random person. I was like, "So, can I just ask you some questions? I'm like American." And I was like, "This is probably not like, I don't know if like this is gonna be like super ethnocentric or whatever, but I just thought it'd be a fun way to talk to them about this." And that's how I learned about like one and like zero and all those things. And I was like very surprised, but it was just very interesting. So I figure it's just like because of dating apps. I think dating apps is like very much like a lot of a very common way for queer people to meet each other like internationally. So
awesome. My question was, I saw the use of the terms girls love and boys love. I know that's typically a term associated with like graphic literature, especially in like Japan and South Korea. Do you know if it has the same kind of connotation there in China in reference to like yaoi or
yeah, I think it
that
does.
kind of culture?
Yeah, I think Chinese people definitely still like look at those graphic novels and like anime and like manga and stuff. So
Cool.
yeah. Thanks for your questions.
Sally, I had a question. So your second to last term, which was like the literal translation of coming out of the closet, right? Are you aware of any other like terms similar to it or like alternatives to it? Because I know that in Tagalog, the term for coming out of the closet is paglalad na kapa, which literally means unfurling the cape. So it's like a different metaphor. And I was wondering if there was other versions of that in Mandarin.
Yeah, great question. I actually was wondering that. I think I heard her talk. I think the person I was talking to at the bar, like explained another term, but I didn't understand what it was, because my Chinese is still not like super great yet. So I think there are different terms for it, but I just wasn't super aware of it.
That's so cool. Oh, go.
Sally, yeah, so I'm assuming that these terms are from a particular dialect of Mandarin, right? Have you explored different dialects of Mandarin or like Mandarin in connection with like Cantonese or Hakka or Hokkien? Is that
No,
something?
I haven't, but that would be really wonderful, like further research. I think, yeah, this was like southern China. There's just so many dialects too. And it was actually kind of sad, like hearing their story while they were talking about this. They were talking about um, like kind of being kicked out of their family and like they were from a rural area and then had to like move to the city to like make money and things like that. So yeah, I think definitely should research further into like the different dialects and how that affects the different terminology. I do wonder if like since a lot of like the ones and zeros, like everything's like some of those are on dating apps, if that is something that's like more standardized. But I'm sure some terms are like more exclusive to a region. Thanks for your question.
Yeah, so region, and then going back to your dating app, probably age is also a factor as well to a lot of this. So, for your future research questions, it would be really good to keep in mind the different demographic so age and region and all these other factors. And I would be interested in seeing how that plays out. That would be really cool research, Sally.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for your help with this so far too.
Yeah, I was thinking that also like just the linguistics of like dating app communication would be interesting to study. And then within certain languages and certain communities, like the LGBTQ plus community, the linguistics of their dating apps and talking, I think would be really cool to look at. And how cool is the metaphor of unfurling the cape?
Right.
That's so cool. Thanks for sharing that with us, Abby. So if someone has one more quick question, or we can move on to our next panelist. Okay, so next we have Daria Moore. Her pronouns are they, them, their pronouns are they, them, theirs. They are a sophomore here at WSU. They're pursuing a BA in Biological Sciences with a minor in Art and Design, as well as a certificate in Environment and Sustainability, and are also following the Emory Lindquist Honors Scholar track. They are planning to go to graduate school for marine biology, and would love to research either cephalopods or marine botany, as well as being a professor. Clap emojis for them, please.
Hi everyone. Okay, let's see if I can get this to work. Okay, is that working? Okay, cool. Okay, so my presentation today, oh, there we go. So, my research is over LGBTQ plus inclusive language and terminology in the healthcare system. And specifically, I'm focusing on the inclusive language and terminology here in the US, specific to English. And so LGBTQ plus individuals frequently report having negative non-inclusive healthcare experiences, with 1 in 6 experiencing discrimination and 1 in 5 avoiding medical care due to the fear of discrimination. And studies have even shown that experiencing discrimination, not only it increases health disparities and is associated with a wide range of negative health outcomes. And so specifically in healthcare settings, these negative experiences are often caused by a lack of proper education for healthcare workers, as well as interdisciplinary issues and prejudice on both personal and institutional levels. And so creating inclusive healthcare settings are crucial to the equitable treatment and health outcomes of LGBTQ plus patients. And increasing the cultural competency of healthcare workers begins with the proper education in schools, as well as healthcare workers continuing their education throughout their careers. And a little definition about what cultural competency is. Cultural competency is the integration and transformation of knowledge about individuals and groups of people into different specific standards, policies, practices, and attitudes that are used in appropriate cultural settings. And this is used to increase the quality of services as well as the outcome of services as well. And so one of the easiest and most effective ways to create an inclusive and welcoming environment is through queer linguistics. And queer linguistics is an extensive range of language studies related to the intersections of gender and sexuality in language usage. And so the earlier and more frequently that queer linguistics is talked about, the more likely it is that healthcare workers will be able to remember and use this. And so this is important because many social gender categories are often grammaticalized in different languages and are often, in different languages, and are most of the times these linguistic genders are binary. And the gender binary is the presumption that there are only two genders, male and female, and that every single individual fits into these categories. And also gendered language, this is the language in which the form of noun, verb, or pronoun is presented as either masculine or feminine. And so English has many different types of gendered language, which is pronominal gender, lexical gender, discursive gender, and masculine generics. And so pronominal gender is the gender distinctions in personal pronouns. So for example, pronouns such as he, him, his, which are seen as masculine, and she, her, hers, which are seen as feminine. However, pronouns do not always equate to someone's gender and can be harmful to the LGBTQ plus individuals, specifically more for those in the transgender community who do not necessarily identify as male or female and don't use masculine or feminine pronouns. And this can be harmful when someone assumes the person's pronouns. And so specifically in healthcare settings, one of the ways that people can work with this is not assuming someone's gender and not automatically using he, him, his pronouns or she, her, her pronouns for someone based off of the way that they look or the way that they their voice sounds, and use either gender neutral pronouns such as they, them, theirs, or just use no pronouns at all until you're able to ask. And then you have the lexical gender, which are usually pairs of words with gender distinctions. And words like these, words such as waiter, which is typically masculine, and waitress, which is typically feminine, as well as steward, which is masculine, and stewardess, which is feminine. But actually a lot of these words with gender distinctions also have genderless alternatives. So instead of using waiter or waitress, you could use server. Instead of using steward or stewardess, you could use flight attendant. And these are a lot more inclusive, just because you're not assuming someone's gender, and it's a lot more inclusive for those who do not identify within the gender binary. And then you have discursive gender, which is the construction of gender in discourse. So vocabulary, intonation, correctness, and thematics. And these all play a role in how you form associations with gender. And then you have masculine generics, which is language internalized biases where you tend to masculinize subjects. So for example, automatically using terms such as mankind instead of humankind, or businessman instead of business person. And then also things such as automatically using he, him, his pronouns for someone you don't know and you don't know their pronouns, and say you use he for them. Or automatically assuming, I'm using him, his pronouns for inanimate objects. And so a lot of times gendered language is enforced from a young age, and it's something that you might not even notice that you are using because it's something that you're so used to. And Lyra Borditsky, she's a professor of cognitive sciences at UCSD. She had a quote that says, even what might be deemed frivolous aspects of language can have far-reaching subconscious effects on how we see the world. And I think that this is a really good quote from her because it shows how gendered language can have effects on how individuals not only see the world around them, but the people in it as well. And this can be particularly harmful to the LGBTQ plus community, as a lot of times gendered language enforces the idea of heteronormativity, which is the presumption that heterosexuality is the only sexual orientation, and then that's the norm, as well as the assumption that everyone automatically falls into the gender binary. And this usage of gendered language, especially within healthcare settings, which is presumably supposed to be a safe place for all individuals, can be harmful and make LGBTQ plus individuals feel unwelcomed. For example, yearly more than 1.8 million LGBTQ plus youth ages 13 to 24 are estimated to have seriously considered suicide. But something that healthcare workers aren't really taught in school, and is that by using correct language and by using things such as an individual's chosen name and their correct pronouns can actually reduce suicidality by 56%. And so language has the power to validate and acknowledge identities, but it also has the power to deny it if used incorrectly. And that's why it's so important that healthcare workers learn how to use and continue to use inclusive language. I know, for example, my experiences as a non-binary individual within the healthcare system have been anything but positive. Ever since I came out as non-binary and have started telling my medical professionals, my doctors, that I am non-binary and that my pronouns are they, them, theirs, I've had maybe one positive experience. And even then, that wasn't with my doctor, it was with one of the people that I interviewed for this project. And so it is a large issue. And there are tons of things that healthcare workers can do to be more inclusive of the LGBTQ plus community. And so for language specifically, healthcare workers can do things such as using gender neutral language and inclusive language. So asking for an individual's pronouns, instead of automatically making assumptions about a person's gender identity or sexual orientation. Also using terms like partner or significant other instead of boyfriend or girlfriend. Or simply asking, are you seeing someone or are you in a relationship? Rather than, oh, do you have a boyfriend? Do you have a girlfriend? And so those are just simple things that healthcare professionals can do. And just learning about the community and taking the time to educate yourself about through language use and then also about the community in general, super important for healthcare workers. And that's, yeah. Acknowledgements. For this project, Dr. Amanda McGoy and Caitlin and I were both essential to teaching me because they gave me a lot of perspectives from healthcare workers, and also Dr. Rachel Shostak. She helped me with learning more about queer linguistics and also learning more about, well, everything. So yeah, and then here are my references. If anyone would like them, I have a lot more. I could talk about this topic forever, but I will not. But there are a bunch of great resources out there. And then also a competency toolkit, which is not only really good for healthcare workers, but just for individuals who want to learn more about inclusive language and queer linguistics and how to go about implementing that. And so, yeah.
Thank you, Daria. So we'll go ahead and open up for questions now. I'll start us off. And in your research, because you're focusing on healthcare providers, do you know if WSU offers anything in their healthcare education classes that they're giving to the healthcare students, anything like this?
So actually, I had to do research for my language and community class, and this is where this project came from. Except for that one, I was more focused on the College of Health Professions here at WSU and education within the College of Health Professions. And from all of the individuals that I've spoken to who are in the College of Health Professions, they have said that they have received little to no education over the LGBTQ plus community in their classes. And actually, other studies done at other schools have shown that there is also little to no education in the majority of healthcare schools and medical schools And one of the resources here even said that in order for medical professionals to be culturally competent over the LGBTQ plus community, they need at least 35 hours of LGBTQ plus patient-centered education and care. However, most schools go anywhere from 1 hour to 5 hours of education. So yeah, and here at WSU, we're in that 1 to 5 hours of minimal education.
I had a question as well. First off, thank you so much, Daria, for presenting today. I really enjoyed your presentation. I thought it was very robust and informational. The question that I had for you was, this is somewhere along the same vein as Katie's question. Is there any sort of research that you came across that maybe suggested safe space training would be something that like could be done for healthcare professionals? I understand that, especially when it comes to medical uh, issues, medical dilemmas, medical care, it's more than just being a safe space. Like doctors should be equipped with the abilities to take care of queer individuals. But I was curious if you came across anything along that vein.
Yeah, actually, yes. There were quite a few resources that aren't on here that I found that did talk about how educating, like here at WSU, we have, why can't I think of the name of it right now? We have it's basically like a safe space training for teachers. And so a lot of articles that I found over that, it talked about sort of implementing programs like the one that we have here at WSU, but it's for health professionals instead. And actually the programs that did try and do that, they had more successful LGBTQ plus patient interactions with their medical professionals than those who did not have it. So yeah, I hope that made sense.
Yeah, it did. Thank you so much.
I will just plug in also, I put it in the chat, but WSU's Office of Diversity and Inclusion offers safe zone training for students for free as well.
But it is safe zone.
Yeah.
I think Landon, I don't know if you meant to raise your hand, but.
Yeah, I just have a quick question.
Mhm.
I know many of us LGBT people have people in our lives that don't think that this is very important and that we should all just keep to ourselves. So what would you say to a person in your life that holds that opinion in regards to this research that you've been doing?
Well, actually, that is something that I have experience with. My aunt, well, one of my aunts is extremely homophobic and transphobic, and so I've had to talk to her a little bit about this. And so for me, well, I just kind of talked to her about it and talked with my experiences, and then also talking about like statistics. Well, they can be like talking about how like 1 in 5 individuals have avoided healthcare because of fear of discrimination, talking about like that and how that can have negative effects and how it can lead to so many individuals becoming severely sick or even dying because they weren't able to go and receive health care because they were scared, or because they have had negative experiences, or because a doctor was prejudiced and wouldn't listen to that individual. And I know personally, talking a lot about my experiences really helped her too. Well, she's, it's she's still not the best, and she's not really someone that I will continue to have in my life. I think talking to her was really good because it did help her realize a little bit the importance of it. And also, while she still does not fully understand like me and why I am non-binary and like why I'm a lesbian, she's sort of like listening to those facts and listening to like my experiences, and especially like the statistics about youth suicide. That was a really hard-hitting point for her because she has young kids right now. And one of the points that I made to her, I was like, what if one of your kids ends up being a part of the community? Like, what are you going to do then? Like, that's not really the best worded answer, kind of long, but just talking to them. And if they don't want to listen, then like for me personally, I've come to the realization that like if someone isn't willing to listen, and if someone doesn't want to learn about me or respect me as an individual, then personally, I don't think that they're worth being in my life or they're worth my time if all they're going to do is make me feel like I don't belong in this world. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions?
I had a question. Based on the research that you've done, do you think that if we get to see more of like the medical field being using more like gender neutral language and be more inclusive, that we get to see that like translation to more like a social settings? Because I know like a lot of like scientific things influence what we see in like our normal society.
Yeah, I definitely think that having more medical professionals using gender neutral language and using more inclusive language could definitely have an effect on other individuals. The only issue that I can see happening is like recently with COVID, seeing how other individuals like interact with scientists. That has been something that has given me a little bit of concern. But like even just if medical professionals use that language and then them going home and using that language with their friends or with their family and teaching them, I think that could have a good effect. And
Thank you.
Sonia, of course.
Okay. Hey, friend. So, one of the things that you had kind of mentioned in class too was the fact that, you know, because it's so institutionalized, like there's got to be something more than just like provider training, because while that's like a first base interaction, that we, in order to get like institutional change, we've got to have something systemic implemented.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember that you talked a little bit about like kind of like those I don't know, I want to say entrance like
Oh,
patient
yes.
forms and stuff like that. But I wanted to see if there was something else that you thought maybe is like also a really good way of kind of changing the entire culture of the healthcare system. Because I think if we kind of rely on individuals, like you said, like prejudice plays like a huge part. So I didn't know if you had any other ideas as well on that.
Yes, I will actually pull up that form because I think that that would be a good thing to show everyone. Uh, so what Sonia is talking about is in order to make change, like since this is such an institutional level, like starting change more on a systemic level. And one of the things that I talked about in our class that's a good starting point is sorry, noises, patient forms. And so patient forms like this one, absolutely amazing. M-Care here in Wichita, absolutely amazing. If you guys ever need any care, I highly recommend them. Dr. McGoy is absolutely amazing. But so registration form, they have a lot of great things on here, a lot of inclusive language. So places for your pronouns, And then also the thing that I liked about this form was for your legal name and legal sex. They explained why they needed that. And then also they have like here for your sexuality and your gender. They have a lot of different options. And this is by far just one of the best incoming patient medical forms I've seen, because along with having you fill out what your sexuality, gender, and what your sexuality and gender is, they also have a lot of spaces down here for your medical history and your surgical history. And so a lot of the things that they have within your medical history, like STIs, which is something that the LGBTQ plus community is at a higher risk for. They also have places that add surgical history for like transgender individuals, if you want to have your ovaries removed, or if you have chest masculinization. They have a bunch of different options on here for that, which is something that I haven't seen before on forms. And then they also have, where is it down here? It may not be down here, but this is really great. But to answer that question as well, sorry for getting off track. I personally could see just like for systemic level, starting with those forms, and then also potentially like not only with education, but also creating more LGBTQ plus specific health clinics that actually get funded. Because that's one of the issues that I had talked about with the MCare clinic here, is that they don't get a lot of funding because they are a clinic that's meant to help underrepresented communities and minorities here in Wichita. And unfortunately, because of that, they don't get a lot of funding. And so sometimes it's hard for them to be able to want to support everyone and also be able to pay their workers. And so finding that funding for clinics like that.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Daria, I wondered how you learned about the M clinic and or M care clinic, and if in your research you came across any like maybe organizations or coalitions, or even just a website that would help queer individuals find these inclusive providers.
I actually did not think about looking to see if there was like a giant document for that. That's a great idea. I'll have to look more into that, because that would be a super helpful resource. Or if there isn't one, even like creating one. But I found MCare actually with the help of Dr. Shostak. One of her friends had gone to MCare to get hormone treatment. And so she told me about the clinic, and then I was able to get in contact with Dr. McGoy. So yeah. And then I also know a couple of other individuals who have gone to MCare as well for treatment.
Yeah, I just love that form
Yeah.
so much. Yeah, that's like, and it's something like after you see it, you're like, well, this is a no-brainer, right?
Yeah, because I know like on almost all of my forms, like my medical forms, because unfortunately I have to go to the doctor a lot. I always end up having to like cross out everything and then like draw an arrow and put my pronouns, and then because they only have two options for gender most of the time, cross those out, put an arrow, and put that I'm non-binary, which I don't know if you're supposed to do that, but I do anyways. But yeah, so inclusive forms are just such a great starting point, because usually I can tell if I'm going to have a bad experience based off of the forms that I have to fill out.
Yeah, and I wonder also too, I don't know much about healthcare. Oh, Sonia put in the chat, the LGBT plus health coalition has some compiled information about providers, and she dropped the link in there for everyone. But I notice a lot of like big hospitals are like Catholic hospitals, right? And then we talk about funding and like issues with that. So I also had a friend with the student evaluations. They always ask for gender, and they would cross it out and put, I'm not going to fill this out until you change this. So I don't know. You'll like pay attention to your SVTEs and see if they made a difference.
Yeah.
Okay. So if we don't have any other questions, another round of emoji clap hands for Daria. Thank you so much for that presentation. Next we have Blake. And Blake is a first-year English graduate student and instructor here at Wichita State University. Though his concentration is in literary analysis, linguistics is a field of study that is dear to him. He hopes to continue his scholarship and education so that he may become a loud and proud queer voice in the academic community. A round of clap emojis for Blake.
Hi, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming. We didn't really get to preface this too much, but the Linguistics Club has been working super hard to make this happen for nearly 2 years now. Me, Abby, and Sally especially. So I'm super appreciative of all of you coming, and I'm so happy to see this come into fruition. I'm going to share my screen now. Can everybody see it?
Yes.
Terrific. So my presentation is called That's Offensive, Analyzing Perceptions on Terminology, Identifying LGBTQIA+ Individuals. Like I said, I'm Blake Overman. I was introduced, I identify with he, they pronouns, which basically for me is either or. I just don't like singular he pronouns. A lot of this was from my work in Dr. Menon's History of the English Language class. This was my capstone project that I turned into a little bit of a research study. So without further ado, let's dive in. So my research questions were, do people perceive the terminology of LGBTQIA+ individuals differently based on circumstance? And I say circumstance here is kind of a broad term, whether it's their own sexual identity, own gender identity, race, religion, that sort of thing. And the second one is there a consensus on acceptable and unacceptable terms within the sample group that I have for my research? So the methods that I had for this specific study were I administered a questionnaire with 10 terms to a group of 30 people. And with the data that I gathered, I tried to analyze what trends there were in relation to those circumstances that I'd mentioned on differing levels of acceptability of each term, trying to get a good sense of what queer or LGBTQIA+ terms were acceptable based on who was answering the survey. I made some graphs just to show the kind of differences in between groups and how these factors might influence responses. Oh, sorry. I wanted to identify some limiting factors for the study because I do want to say that I think if I were to do this, I need a much larger sample as well as a more diverse sample. So what you're getting here, I would say, is representative of a new crop of English teachers. So it's a very specific sample, but basically that's what this research is dispositions of English teachers from Kansas in Wichita. Like, don't take this as a national kind of survey because it's not. But this is kind of giving you a sense of at least our community, these queer terms, what kind of connotation they carry. Certain groups are not represented at all. In fact, everybody who answered the survey identified as cis gendered, and they're also all college educated, at least somewhat. I can't guarantee that they all went on and graduated, but you know. And then my own biases. It's something that I had to obviously discuss because I'm somebody who is a queer individual, and I use the word queer in a positive light. It's one of the terms that's on the survey, so therefore, you know, there's bias there already. I tried to, at least in the administering of the survey, reduce the amount of times I use the word queer. That's why you see the acronym LGBTQIA+, is because I didn't want to influence anybody in a certain way. I wanted it to be as authentic as I could possibly get. Also, I am somebody who doesn't necessarily identify as cis, but is like, you know, just kind of a weird queer gender identity. But I am male presenting. So that is another factor that is limiting. All right, so here are the two graphs that reveal the respondents of the demographics. That was the word that I was looking at. So as you can see, I had 20% of respondents identify as bisexual, 3.3% as asexual, 3.3% as pansexual, 10% as homosexual, and then 63.3% as heterosexual. So even though there's a large heterosexual group, there is a surprising amount of queer, like LGBTQIA+ individuals for this sample. So I think that is notable, that even though the majority is still straight cis people, there is a larger population of queer voices in this survey than normal. And then in terms of gender identity, I've already went over this, that everybody identified as Lisa cis, but the large sample is of cisgendered females or cisgendered women, with only around a fourth being cisgendered males. Okay, so the Q word. This was the one that kind of started me off on this journey of research, because I was really, really interested in the use of the word queer as a blanket term, as an umbrella term to cover over, like, everybody in the LGBTQI+ community. It's something that has been used and has been reclaimed in so many different ways. But I think that it comes from a place of a specific group kind of dictating a way to label an entire group of people, like a much larger group of people. You know, it's one of those terms in a similar way of what Abby was speaking about. You know, Latinx is another term that is kind of similar in the ways that it's used as a blanket term, but not necessarily always readily accepted by the people who, you know, would identify as it, especially with Latinx, the X not being part of, you know, like normal Spanish linguistics. So I really wanted to dig deeper into the use of the Q word, especially as it's used as both a noun and an adjective. So somebody can be queer, but you can also be called a queer, if that makes sense. So I can be a queer man, but I can also be called a queer. And then I wanted to move into the breaking down of a few terms. So I only took a few terms from that big survey that I mentioned, and I'm kind of going to break down how each of them were perceived by the sample. So the average score is 3.5, and the most common score was 4, and we had a presence of a 5. So before I like break down as to what this means, I presented each term with a scale from 1 to 5, 1 being acceptable and 5 being not acceptable, like never use it, bad, bad, bad stuff. So I was really surprised that queer was not a term that at least my largely heterosexual sample did not approve of. And like I said, there's a presence of a 5 where the 5 is denoting that like it should not even have a place in regular language. Like I would never use it, essentially. So I did want to break off a little bit from the large kind of perception of queer by breaking it into the specific queer version, like just taking the people who filled out the survey who identify as part of the LGBTQIA plus community. I didn't have any 5s. The average score was a 3, so it's more acceptable. And I had a lot of write-ins that really were saying like, queer is fine as long as it's being used within our community. So a lot of the time when I would get like the 2s and 3s or even 4s, as you can see, the majority of the respondents were 4s, it would be because I am fine with the term, but I don't like people who are not queer to use that term. So I just wanted to bring up a few points of consideration upon just like reflecting on where we got this word that we use now, especially in scholarship, in academia, and there's been a big push to just kind of normalize using queer in like everyday speech. Queer's been in the lexicon for about 500 years. It was first recorded being used in 1513. It's believed to come from the word queer, which is a German word meaning oblique or perverse, which I thought was, you know, a little problematic in terms of what that came from. And then only in the 1980s do we start hearing its modern usage. And when I say the modern use, I mean as an identifying term rather than a slur, right? Which is another whole like thing to investigate. And that was a lot of the reason that I made the distinction between whether you agree with it being a noun or an adjective, is because in most cases, when queer is being used as a noun, it's derogatory. Whereas an adjective, it's typically a more positive connotation because it's typically seeing somebody as an individual. Like if I am an individual who is queer, is a lot different than being called a queer. So again, these are all findings and conclusions that are relevant only to one term, but I did want to provide us with a little focus for my survey, because going over all 10 terms and the way that they were used would be quite long. But queer is a word I think is still undecided if it's acceptable. I think queer, just like some of the other umbrella terms that have been tried to come up with to just like address a giant demographic, is going to have pushback. And averages are pretty similar in both heterosexual and queer groups. And I think that this is a question for just consideration. Do we need a new umbrella term, or like, should we just reject umbrella terms? I feel like there's always like drawbacks to it. I understand that there is like, you know, a sense of community that comes with umbrella terms. But at the same time, I feel like time and time again, with both Abby's examples and mine, I think that umbrella terms for so many different identities that are not monolithic are really, really hard to really pinpoint and get everybody on board with, especially when they're coming from the homogenous group of like mostly white, cisgendered queer people in academia, you know, and it just gets kind of funneled down to everybody else. So with that, my further research, if I ever get the chance to continue researching this, which I really hope to, I'm kind of bogged down in all of my like, you know, English work outside of linguistics. But I'd like to do a similar survey to a larger audience and sample. Like I said, mine's largely homogenous, so it's not really indicative of the entire United States or even the entire state. Yeah, and that basically sums up my second point as well. And here are my works cited. A lot of this comes from just the notions of reclamation of terms, and gave me a good touch point for analyzing the terms that I chose. And that is my presentation. Thank you all so much for listening to me.
Thank you, Blake. That was awesome. So we'll go ahead and open up for some questions.
I guess this isn't really a question. I'm still like formulating in my mind, but I guess I was like kind of surprised by your results. And that's probably just like my English student background showing through, but because we talk about the use of an umbrella term, like especially in queer studies, you know, at least to me, it seems like the people around me at Wichita State, the people on the 6th floor of Linguists would be very comfortable with the term queer, even if they're not part of the queer community, because they are familiar with queer studies and that word being used in, I guess, a positive light. So I was sort of surprised by, you know, even the presence of a 5 on your results there. And then also, I think this is tangentially related, and I'm going to bring up zines again because I'm always talking about zines, but I read a zine that was published in 1997, and it reminded me of this because in the zine there is an article talking about an umbrella term for people of color. And specifically they say they did not like the term people of color because it felt like it was making them second-class citizens to white people. You know, white people aren't people of whiteness, they're just people. And so they were arguing for the use of the term non-white people rather than people of color. And I think that that's interesting because today it's so widely acceptable. So I wonder if something similar would happen with queer where, you know, there is a bit of a dispute now, but it'll like kind of settle in the future, or if we are going to come up with a new term.
Yeah, thank you so much for your questions, Abby. I think on the first point, I do want to say that these were, my sample weren't necessarily English majors, they were English education majors. I don't know if that has much to do with it, but yeah, I agree that, you know, it is surprising. I was surprised by my results as well, just because I do think that we're in an academic setting where queer supposedly like really took its roots and was reclaimed. So yeah, super surprising to me. But I think it also shows that like, I think sometimes with academic terms, there can almost be like a feeling of like I have to use it or I'm seen as like not being inclusive. But at the same time, not everybody is comfortable with those terms. So it's a dilemma that is definitely difficult to be in. On the second point, I think that it's really difficult to talk about any minority groups, especially when all the language, I feel like, treats them as minorities, because there is that constant kind of putting the focus on the majority. I like, just from you hearing the word non-white, I wouldn't feel comfortable using it, just because I feel like it still puts focus on being white. It's like no, I'm like outside of that group, you know. But I don't know, like I'm not a person who is an authority on that, so I really can't say. And I think that's one of the most pressing dilemmas, is I feel that we need to let the people who are part of those communities come up with the language. Like, I think that it's something that is difficult even within those communities, though, just because of generational differences. One of the terms that was on the list, I think if I had a larger sample, queer would have a much different response, just because there are some people who grew up being called queer in a derogatory term. I think back, if anybody was born in the 60s and it lived through the AIDS pandemic, being called, all these different terms that are very different than what they mean today, it'd be substantially different. So that's kind of a long-winded answer, but I think that I would settle on that I think we need, as a scholarly and academic community, move away from like labeling groups and expecting everybody to be okay with it, especially the people that are part of those communities.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for your question.
Yeah, you mentioned something that kind of brought me back to a point that Abby brought when you were talking about different generations' perceptions of language, and that the effect of like colonialism and religious indoctrination erasing so much. We have a question from Bethany C. asking, do you think you would see differences in opinion based on the age of people answering the survey?
Bethany, thank you so much for your question. I think I started answering that a little bit with Abby's question, but the survey sites that I had were mostly college students. So it was fairly homogenous. I mean, there were a few older students, but not very many. I think that, yeah, for a lot of the same points that I was speaking about Abby's question, I think that it really depends on how the community around you as you grew up especially used those terms, because like what Abby's presentation showed, younger people like to use queer terms in positive ways. So, like if I were to administer this to a bunch of Gen Z people, it'd probably be very different. Just as if I were to administer the survey to a largely like baby boomer population, or even Gen X, I think the survey would be quite different, just because they grew up before the reclamation of words like queer, and even like queer people using like slurs in a positive way. Like it's very, very different based on how old you are. Yeah, of course. Thank you again.
Can you think of any alternative umbrella term words that like you think would be like, I don't know, just like better? I don't know.
So I haven't come up with an umbrella term, or even like seen one suggested for the entire community. I know that I'm going to use a term we were just debating, but people of color who are queer have advocated for the use of the word queer, which is almost similar to your presentation. But I think that there is this misconception that like the plights of queer people is constantly seen as white, cisgendered, gay men. And I think that there is a need for a differentiation there, because just like heterosexual communities, they're the ones who are put at the forefront of everything. And they're the ones with privilege, and they're the ones who are also doing the discriminating in the community, right? So I don't know. I'm getting more and more on board with the rejection of umbrella terms, but I do think it's difficult, especially when you're trying to advocate and be a more of a community, you know, because we're getting to the point where, especially today, with just everybody deciding to hate on transgendered people, that there is like a need for community. And I think an umbrella term helps that, but like outside of things like that, umbrella terms are kind of bad.
Yeah, I feel that for sure.
Blake, thank you again for your presentation. I mean, I'm always reminded when I see your presentation that it easily ranks as one of the best presentations I've had in English Linguistics 317. Blake, I remember when he approached me with this topic, pretty early on in the semester, it was quite ambitious, and I was worried that within the time frame that we had, with the data collection and the analysis, whether we would be able to pull it off, and he did. And he also got an IRB approval for this project, which was not a requirement for the class. And he did it all. So, it was very impressive. And because we have IRB approval, I want to urge you to, maybe collect more data, because, you have the approval from IRB to do that, and two, to submit the project somewhere. So publish the data and kind of get the word out. And I really think that, and I know you're busy with other things, but really collecting more data, maybe like opening it out to non-WSU population, like even maybe not Wichita, but the broader kind of community, to kind of collect more data to see, is this true of other kind of demographic populations and other regions, and then maybe writing up the entire thing and submitting it to a journal would really, really be good, because I really think this is valuable research. So
Thank you so much, Dr. Menon.
Yeah, I would second that and say that you have like a large sample at your fingertips, even just like going through all the GTAs and saying, hey, give this survey to your students. So yeah, but that again is just like WSU community. Yeah, super impressive. You had talked about how like white male centric around a lot of issues is like the perspective, and it made me think of Marsha P. Johnson, right, who's often forgotten about, but was a gay rights activist and very heavily involved in Stonewall. And I think the same thing happens with feminism, right? Like it's a very like a whitewashed area. So yeah. And then I did have a question, and I think you already addressed it though, was the perception of rating it mostly 4 and then the 1-5, the written in responses, was it because they were perceiving that it could be offensive, or?
Yeah, so my 4 and 5s were mostly from the heterosexual sample. And I think that is just coming from the taboo use of the word. This is based off of an assumption on my part, so it might not be accurate, but like I said, I think it's long been used as a slur. I mean, like you think back of like football, the football game Smear the Queer, right? I mean, there's like plenty of derogatory uses of the term. So I believe that the answering of the 5 there is rooted in that sense of the word. The write-ins came from the mostly LGBTQIA+ individuals. And like I said, it was just because there is, and I don't know how I feel, like I both agree and I'm pretty ambivalent, let me say that. about the use of like the policing of the term. So saying that it's only cool if queer people use the word queer. You know, I'm ambivalent towards it. I understand that side of things, but I also don't believe in policing language. So, you know, that's I guess a whole nother discussion to have, you know?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Well, I don't see anyone with a hand raised. We do have the space until 2. So if panelists want to speak, or if, you know, anyone has any other general questions, I want to thank everyone for coming and participating. This has been a very fruitful and informative panel. So thank you, Linguistics Club and our panelists, for sharing your research with all of us.
I did want to say, if our presentations got you interested in any form of linguistics, Dr. Menon and Dr. Shostak both teach plenty of linguistics related courses that I encourage you to look into. Additionally, the Linguistics Club, not the Lavender Linguistics Club, unfortunately. The large, broader Linguistics Club hosts meetings pretty often, about every month or 2 weeks, depending on, you know, what the needs are for the semester. But I really encourage you to reach out to either me or Abby, just to, you know, if you ever want to come by and observe a meeting. We're really trying to do more things like this, especially with outreach to the wider university, to get people interested in linguistics, just because it is an area that is often not taught until college level. So we really want you to be a part of it. One last thing, if Dr. Menon wants to talk about it, I think that it's still relatively new news that I want everybody to know about, the applied linguistics major. For anybody who's undecided, I really encourage you to look into it. Dr. Menon, did you want to say anything else about that?
Sure. Thanks for the plug, Blake. We have a brand new applied linguistics major that was approved by the Kansas Board of Regents in December of 2020. We are starting to enroll students in it. It's going to launch in fall of 2021. So if you are interested, I am very happy to meet with you, make an appointment to talk about it. I also have a couple of applied linguistics majors online on this call who would also be willing, I know, to talk to people if you're interested in thinking about this as a major. It is in the new catalog. So if you look at the new undergraduate catalog for 2021, 2022, you will be able to find all the information there. So thank you for that, Blake.
Of course, I'm all about spreading the good word. I'm super excited about the major, and it's definitely one that would have put me into a little bit of a existential crisis had I had the option when I was an undergrad.
I think Raul wants to say something. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question. So I know that me as an interpreter, I've noticed a lot of things, and I've talked to some of my language teachers, and I've been to events before COVID, of course, where I will speak to people about like their healthcare, how does it go with their healthcare provider, and I've noticed that a lot of them, like especially like Persian, Arabic, and Hispanic communities, they think that a lot of the progressive ideas from, like, you could say, like, what Western ideas are very, like, not okay. and I'm wondering if it's something to do with the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, whether, since in their language, there's a lot of religious, like, from sayings to proverbs to just mixed into their language, that could it be that their language is determining like why they don't accept the progressive ideas? If that makes sense.
Is this a question to the panelists? Do you have anybody in mind particularly?
Just like to whoever has like an opinion or.
I mean, I somewhat agree. It's just the Catholicism is just so high, so rampant, you know, you can't really do nothing.
I was going to say that I think that a lot of that has to deal with the field of cultural or anthropological linguistics, which heavily examines just the place that culture shapes language. Um, I'm not an expert on it by any means, but I did take a course with Dr. Kreinot on anthropological linguistics. So if it's something that interests you further, I'm not sure if he's still teaching it or not, but I would look into it.
Yeah, Raul, I think that's a good question and is probably tied with a lot of complex answers. I even think English speakers with heavy ties to their religion have difficulty doing that as well.
To kind of piggyback on what Katie Ann Blake said, yes, I agree that language, has a role to play in it, but I think religion and your upbringing and, your cultural assumptions that have been passed on to you plays a huge role. So, and especially because you're talking about different countries, we really need to bring in that context without just looking at language as a completely isolated, construct of that society. So, and I wouldn't be surprised if there is work done in this area, Raul. And Dr. Kreinot would be, more familiar with that literature.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank the Linguistics Club for putting this together. I mean, I know how hard all of you have worked. I mean, Blake, this is, Blake's baby, I want to say, like your brainchild. And he wanted to have this panel last year around this time, but that's when COVID happened. So, I'm really glad that you all persisted through COVID, through a pandemic, to bring this together and have this event. Thank you so much to all the presenters. Your talks were wonderful. And, I love having more of these kind of outreach events because I think, going back to Daria's point, if we want to bring a change in society, people need to know that there is a gap and a barrier, and one of the ways in which we can kind of, bridge that gap is to start having more of these events and educate the public. So, great job, guys.
Thank you so much, Dr. Menon. That also reminded me, I don't know if anybody from the Office of Diversity and Inclusion are here, but I did want to thank them as well. I think that they were instrumental in getting the word out about this, and it was such a great opportunity to be part of the larger event schedule for this month. So really, really thank you so much for that.
Yeah, and I just want to thank all the presenters again and thank Katie for moderating. And like I said in the chat, you can reach out to me if you're interested in Linguistics Club, or Blake also put his email in there. So we look forward to hosting more events like this, and hopefully some of you will show up to those and maybe some club meetings as well, because we have fun. But thank you again for everyone for attending, and we're probably going to end the meeting here unless there are any last minute questions. Well, everyone have a good day.
Bye, guys. Great job.